All right, thanks, Amy. Good morning, everybody. Happy to be here. I saw some familiar names on the registration, even though I can't see any of you. So we have a lot to cover. We're going to jump right into it. So as Amy mentioned, just feel free to type a question in the chat as we go, and we will sort of pause every so often to go through some questions. Okay, so this is the Hamilton County Nonprofit Relief Program. So the county received about $158 million in federal funding through the American Rescue Plan, specifically the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund. The Board of County Commissioners set priorities and is creating programs and funds to address a wide range of relief services. And as part of that, they have allocated about $6.3 million to further support Hamilton County nonprofits. So the county has chosen United Way through an RFP process to run the proposal selection process and all the administration for this program. So if chosen, you will subcontract with United Way, and we will disperse funding, collect the required expense documentation, and other reporting required under this funding. And then as a selected grantee, you will be required to submit reporting of different documentation and also, of course, providing your services. Okay, so a few basics just to start out. These are some of our important key dates. So with this program, we actually have a pre-application and a full application. And the pre-application is required. And the deadline for that is going to be December 30th. It is live, and the link is on our website. There's also a link here. This recording and a PDF will be available in the next couple of days on our website, but you can also go to www.uwgc.org/ARP to get to click on the link for the pre-application. And the pre-application is more of a survey tool, a lot of yes/no type questions. And we're going to talk a little bit more about it later, but it is required because it's going to help you and it's going to help us determine which category you fall under. You can see the deadline for the full application under the organizational hardship category, which you'll understand here in a minute, is Tuesday, January 18th at 5 p.m. And then the deadline for the eligible services category is Sunday, January 30th at midnight. And then we will expect to have awards ready by March. Some of them we will likely have in February, but definitely everything should be ready to go by March. Okay, so the basic purpose of the program is to provide relief to nonprofit organizations that provide social and family services and have either been negatively impacted by COVID-19 or provide services to Hamilton County residents that have been negatively impacted by COVID-19. So when we get into the nitty-gritty of some of the different categories, it can get kind of complex. So if what I have been doing as I've been sort of helping put together this program is, if you ever get confused, like you should go back to this purpose. Like, has your organization been negatively financially impacted by COVID-19, or are you providing services to Hamilton County residents that have been negatively impacted by COVID-19? So that kind of helps get you back on track. The grant funding range is from $25,000 to $250,000. So the minimum award is $25,000 and the maximum is $250,000. So some organizations are going to be eligible under both categories. So the minimum and the maximum are for the organization. it's not per category. So if you're eligible under both categories, the most you can still apply for is $250,000. Okay, so we're going to jump into how your organization qualifies for this funding. Before we get into the different categories, just the organizational eligibility. So to be eligible to receive funding through this opportunity, organizations must be a nonprofit with 501c3 tax exempt status that does provide social and or family services. Your organization must be operated for charitable or purposes or community benefit. And your organization must also be principally located, and their principal place of business where services are rendered must be in Hamilton County. So just remember, this is a Hamilton County program. So, operations must, be in Hamilton County that you're applying for. The services must benefit Hamilton County residents. And then a few ineligible organization types are for-profit companies, community organizations that do not have 501c3 status, newly launched nonprofit organizations, which we'll get into in a second, arts and culture organizations, and schools. Those different types are not eligible to receive funds. I will say arts and culture organizations, the county is going to have a separate program for arts and culture. So if you are an arts and culture organization on this call, I would suggest that you contact the county, Holly Christman or maybe Bridget Doherty, and see when that program is going to be coming out. Okay. Eligible organizations must also be registered and in good standing with the state of Ohio Attorney General's office through the charitable registration. So I assume that most nonprofits are. You do have to be registered within 6 months of providing services or incorporation, I think. So, but if you're not currently registered, you can still apply. It only takes a few days, and I think it's at most a couple $100 to register. So if you do the pre-application, it won't kick you out if you're not registered yet, but you will need to show us that you've at least begun the registration process to be able to complete the full application. There's also a webinar on their website if you've with kind of step-by-step instructions on how to do it. Okay, eligible organizations must also be in compliance with all Treasury regulations, including those applicable to its status as a 501c3 and a nonprofit organization under Ohio law. And then organizations must also be able to certify that Hamilton County ARP funding will not be used in place of or instead of other local, state, federal, or other funds already designated for that expense or activity. So if you've received relief, any sort of government relief funding so far, you may be familiar with the terms supplanting of funds or duplication of benefits. So we will have a certification form that all organizations will need to sign and certify as part of it to be eligible for funding. So, and we'll go into a little bit more about specifics on exactly what this means a little bit later. Okay. All right, and then eligible organizations must also have been in operation and provided essential social and family services since March of 2019. That is 2019, that's not a typo. So if your organization is newer than that, unfortunately, you will not be eligible under this program. And eligible organizations, finally, must also be able to provide recent independently reviewed or audited financial statements. So recent is going to mean 2019 or 2020. And then these are the two different types. So the first one is audits. So if the threshold is currently at $750,000 in federal funding, if you're a large organization, if you have or need an audit, and if you're not one of those organizations, we do need the independently reviewed financial statements So that must be by a qualified independent CPA. And so it can't be like your bookkeeper or anything like that. So there's some different resources online that you can look at if you're not sure if you meet those criteria. And also please email us if you have any questions about that. We're happy to answer any and all questions up front. And the best email to do that is impact@uwgc.org. It's on a few slides in here as well if you need the link. Okay. As Amy mentioned, we're going to go into some of the different categories, what types are eligible, expenses, all those things. So before I do that, I want to reiterate that we do have a pre-application for this program, and it is required. And it's going to be due December 30th. There's the link. It's also on our website that Amy put into the chat. So we do realize it's the holidays. So if you're going to have any difficulty with this meeting this deadline, if somebody's out for a couple weeks or anything, please let us know as soon as possible. And we'll do our best to work with you. I'm sure we can work something out. Might just mean a little less time for the full application on your end, but we'll definitely work with you. Just let us know as soon as possible if that deadline is going to be tough. The pre-application is going to take, I think that average is like 9 minutes when we tested it out. So it is not, something that's going to take a lot of time. Again, it is required. It's going to help both you and us determine which category of funding is best for you all to apply under. And then the eligibility flow chart, which we're going to see here in a couple minutes, is going to help walk you through the eligibility as well. Again, some yes or no type of questions. And that will be really helpful to have on hand as you complete the pre-application. And that's also going to be up on our website in the next day or so. Okay. So dive into the eligible use of funds. So just to reiterate, this fund is for nonprofit organizations that have experienced a negative economic impact and or will have addressed or will be addressing negative impacts of Hamilton County residents due to COVID-19. And you must have the ability to demonstrate and document both of those criteria. So we'll get into that for each category here. So here's an overview of how you determine if you're eligible. So as we just went over, your organization itself has to be meet the criteria for eligibility. And then once you've determined that, there are two different categories. So the first one is organizational hardship. So that's where your organization has experienced the negative financial impact due to COVID-19. So this is the first application. It's definitely probably the easier one. And this is the one that's due January 19th, the full application. So the first step in this is going to be showing the financial hardship due to COVID-19. Again, that must be documented, and we'll go over that in a second. And then once you do that, you'll have to show the eligible costs and expenses. Okay, so then, and again, you can apply for both if you're eligible. Eligible services is the second category. That full application is the one that's due January 30th. The two different ways are going to be responding to a specific negative client impact. So that's where the client is going to be eligible. The client themselves is going to have the negative financial impact due to COVID-19. And you'll also have to be able to have expense documentation. Second way under eligible services is responding to impacted populations in a qualified census tract. So that's going to be more location-based eligibility, and then obviously the expense documentation. So I probably just confused everyone, so we're going to go over all of those right now. So the first category, organizational hardship. Again, this is where the organization itself has experienced a negative financial impact due to COVID-19. So the grants will be mitigating financial hardships such as decline in revenue, impact of if you were closed for a while, if you had to cancel annual fundraisers, and then the expense that will support that will be various operating costs. So how do you prove a hardship? That's the first part of the organizational hardship category. So you have to show a net loss of revenue. So in the pre-application, it's really just yes, no questions. We do ask you to estimate your hardship, but there's no documentation required in the pre-application. In the full application, you will be provided or asked to provide details on categories of revenue for each year in a budget type of format. So I think we had the question of when the time period was. So you can choose if you're going to document a loss from 2019 to 2020 or from 2020 to 2021. So if you choose 2019 to 2020, you will have to put in your revenue for each of 2019 and 2020. And 2020 needs to show a net loss, not one line item has a loss. It'll be a net loss in 2020 compared to 2019. You will also have to provide some sort of documentation of that. So we think that probably the easiest ways might be profit and loss statements or 990s for your comparison years. But if you have other documentation, we're definitely open to that. However you think that you can best prove that. So again, just email us and we can discuss that on a kind of a case-by-case basis. Okay, so once hardship is proven, so that's kind of looking backwards. For the American Rescue Plan, actual expenses reimbursed are, the term is generally looking forward. That's how they word it. So once you prove the hardship, you must have the documentable operational expenses moving forward through from January 1st of 2022 through September 30th of 2022, that you want to apply for reimbursement up to the amount of the documented hardship you experienced. So we're going to do some scenarios here in a couple minutes, but let's say that you have a documented hardship. You had a net loss of $50,000 in 2020 compared to 2019. So then from January of 2022 to September of 2022, you can apply for reimbursement of operational expenses up to that $50,000. And again, these operational expenses cannot have other federal, state, local, or other funding already dedicated to them. So if you have, other grants or anything like that that are already paying for those expenses, you won't be able to request reimbursement under this program for the same expenses. I do want to go back to that for just a second. So this will be a little bit clearer, I think, in the application and the RFP document. But if you have, so it doesn't have to be the full January to September. If you have a grant, that ends in June, you can obviously request reimbursement at least for the remaining months. Keep in mind that there is a minimum of $25,000 per organization. Okay, we'll go ahead and move on to the next category, eligible services. So what we just talked about was organizational hardships. That's your organization. We're talking about operational expenses. This is eligible services. So we're going to be talking about programmatic expenses. But to determine if you're eligible, it's based on two things for each of the subcategories. So the first is the type of service for both. They both have different eligible services. And then it's also the individuals served. based on the need or on the location. So this is based on need. This one is based on location. Okay, so the first category, the one based on needs, this is responding to specific negative client impacts, category 2A. Assistance that responds to the identified negative economic impact of COVID-19 in one of the below service types. So under category 2A, these are the eligible service types: job training for the unemployed, job training for underemployed, food assistance, emergency assistance for home repairs and weatherization, and behavioral health care, with some of these subcategories that are eligible. So in this category, you not only have to provide one of those service types, you also have to be able to certify, the client has to be able to certify a test that they had a need for this service due to COVID. So that's generally going to be looking forward. And I do want to mention at this point that we're going to have a mandatory webinar for those organizations who want to apply under eligible services. So category 2A and 2B, that's going to be January 10th. You will receive an invitation directly with the information for that in the next couple of weeks. So we're just doing an overview today. It is complicated, but this is sort of hopefully giving you an idea of what's eligible and then what you might need to provide to get there. So, okay, so again, if you apply under subcategory 2A, you will not only need to provide the detailed documentation for the programmatic expenses to provide those services, but you'll also need to be able to have the client certify or attest that they have a need for that service due to COVID-19. And we will have a template. If you don't already have one yourself, we'll have one that you can alter. It's a couple of sentences and they sign and date it. Okay, so the second subcategory, 2B, responding to impacted populations in qualified census tracts. So you can see the service types that are eligible under this category, quite a few under here. So you not only need to have this service, the service needs to be either provided in a qualified census tract, QCT, in Hamilton County, or the individuals served through one of these services live within a QCT. So, and that has to be documented if it's the individual. If you're not providing the service in the QCT and you're qualifying by the individuals living in the QCT, it must be by street address. Zip code is not specific enough. It'll have to be by address. Okay, so what is a qualified census tract? It is any census tract or equivalent, but in our case, it's a census tract in which at least 50% of households have an income of less than 60% of the area median gross income. The qualified census tracts are defined by HUD and can be found at this link. So here's a snapshot of the 2022. I did make a note. So when you go to this website, if you're thinking of qualifying under this category, they do differ from 2021 and 2022. So if you're looking for your reimbursing for your program expenses moving forward, January to September, you'll need to use this select 2022. And if you happen to want to apply for services from 2021, which again is more complicated, we'll have to go through that in the mandatory webinar on January 10th. But they do change slightly. There's a couple that were in 2021 that are not in 2022. I think maybe like Silverton, somewhere over here, maybe in Mount Airy. So just pay attention to that. Make sure you're looking at the right map for the services that you're talking about. Okay, so under this subcategory for the QCTs, you will need to determine that services they're providing are either located in the QCT or that the families or individuals that you're providing those eligible services to live within the QCT, and you'll have to document both. Again, there's the link for the QCT map. And here's a couple of examples because that one is even a little bit more complex. So if you're providing supportive housing services located in a QCT, you'll need to provide the address and the corresponding QCT of each of the units that you're applying for, in addition to the eligible programmatic expenses. Second example is if your organization employs community health workers to work with families across Hamilton County, you would need to provide street addresses and the QCT of each family, along with eligible programmatic expenses to provide the services, and it's only for the families living in the QCTs. So if you have a countywide program that you wouldn't apply for, you can only, the only eligible expenses will be for those services provided within the QCT. Okay, let's see, where am I? So again, here is kind of that overview. Again, you start with, is your organization itself eligible under this program? As you can now see, organizational hardship is probably going to be the easier one if you're able to document it. Just show that you have had a financial hardship, and you'll have to have some operating expense documentation from January 2022 to September of 2022. Under the eligible services category 2, you can either respond to the specific negative client impact or respond to the impacted populations, and each of those have different documentation. So I'm not going to walk through all of these next couple of slides, but this is the eligibility flowchart that I mentioned. That's going to be really helpful to have on hand and to have already kind of looked at when you do the pre-application. So this particular slide is for the nonprofit organizational hardship. So basically, you just start yes or no, and it'll end with either you may be eligible or you're not eligible, and to maybe move on to the next category. So again, this is going to be available here, and it should be up on our website within the next couple of days. There's eligible services, category 2A. And it does kind of tell you what you'll need under each. So that you can kind of be reminded, you know, even if it's a yes, no, like you have to document it. So that creates, you know, can it create extra work, extra barriers. So just want to make everyone aware of that. And then this is category 2B for the QCT. Okay. Amy, did we want to pause?
Yeah, let's pause for a second.
Pop-ups over here.
I think I captured everyone. A couple of questions that we got a couple different times I think are worth touching base on. And I just want to re-clarify, a lot of the questions we're seeing too are around eligibility. And as you have seen, this is sort of complicated in the case that you can come in one or both of two doors. So there is a general door around organizational hardship, and we have had questions about that. So I'm going to just touch about that. That is an organizational hardship that is measured by a loss of revenue at an organizational level. So that is a net loss in revenue. It is not a net loss across your whole budget, right? It's just within revenue, but it needs to be at an organization level. So showing a loss within just one program is not sufficient. And then you will have the option to choose which years you want to compare. So you'll either need to show that loss and demonstrate that loss of revenue with a fiscal year ending in 2019, comparable to your fiscal year ending in 2020, or you may choose to show that there was a loss in revenue in your fiscal year 2021 in comparison to your fiscal year 2020. So you'll see that we'll show that in the application process, that you'll have choice there. So that was a sort of time period to document the hardship. There is a time period, and we'll talk about the time period with eligible expenses. Typically, that's going to be January of 2022 through September of 2022. So we'll come back to that. And then there's a lot of questions of, you know, I'm not sure if my service category fits. And I just want to reshare to folks that that is why we designed this pre-application survey. At the end of the day, most of the pre-application is actually a decision tree. So we have sort of using that flow chart, we've turned it into a survey tool that really will help you work through those. But there may be times when you're not sure if your service category fits under, or the program you do fits underneath a service category. Sometimes we're referring to the service types. That's when you're just going to have to send an email to impact@uwgc.org. Emily is going to be answering a lot of those. I'll be supporting it, and Laura, another colleague, are sort of behind that email. So that allows us to really effectively use our time and get back to you as soon as possible. So those are, I think, are the couple things. We had some new questions come in. And this is a question around how did the county determine specific eligible services? That's actually all based off of guidelines at a federal level. So those are sort of coming down from the feds. A question about, does a PPP loan forgiveness count as revenue? You might have to, you know that one
If I remember, from what I understand of the program, this is one that we'll get back to you on. We also are already creating like a FAQ document that will be up on the website, which will be helpful. But from what I remember, you could get some of that forgiven as a grant. If it was a grant, I think it would count. If you had to pay it back, we'll have to work through that one. So, but thank you. I'm sure a lot of people probably have that question. So we'll look into that, and we'll put that up on the FAQ. And I don't know who said that, but we can get back to you as directly as well.
Yeah, we can follow up on that.
Yeah.
There was also a question around a documentation for category 2A. So just as a reminder, 2A are specific services that were provided to individuals who needed that service due to a negative impact of COVID. And we talked about the requirement to be able to document that through a certification or attestation form. And so you ultimately, there would be a requirement to provide those letters of certification for folks served by the expenses that you would want reimbursed. So that's, again, this is where categories 2 get very specific.
Mm-hmm.
And then Emily, will you reiterate that sort of someone asked, could you please expand on the statement that said something about how the org could not already have federal, state, or local funding to support the program?
So, so that's based on the expenses that you're going to apply to be reimbursed for. So once you qualify, so for both the hardship and for eligible services, for example, if you have another grant for from United Way that ends for the same expenses that you want to apply for from this program, and that ends, let's say, I think in June, you cannot apply for those same months for the same expenses. I'll say in the United Way case, if you have a United Way grant, please contact us and we will try to work with you. But you know, if you have a CDBG grant that ends in June for the same expenses that you want to apply for through this program, you won't be able to. You can apply for them July, August, September. So essentially, what we have to avoid with federal funding is the duplication of benefits. So we can't use federal funds to pay for something that already has other funding dedicated to it. You know, so hopefully you can find other, either whatever operational or programmatic, whatever you're applying for other expenses to apply for through us, or potentially work with your other funding source so that you can, you know, have as much covered as possible. But you will need to certify that you don't have other funding for the same expenses, and it'll need to be pretty clear that this what you're applying for does not have other funding dedicated to it. I hope that answered the question. It is a tricky thing to work through. So if you have a specific case, please feel free to email us and I'm happy to work through it with you. Okay, any other Q&As at this point, Amy, or should I jump into the expenses?
Let's go ahead and move forward. I'm going to continue to keep up with the questions that are in here.
Okay, great. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit now about the funding amount and the eligible expenses. We just had this question. So in most cases, almost all cases, the eligible expenses, so again, you will have already determined either your hardship or you're going to be providing services under one of the categories. So we're talking here about what you're actually applying to be reimbursed for. So in all categories, in most cases, eligible expenses must be between January and September of 2022. All funding requires detailed expense documentation to ensure that it's eligible. So specifically under category 1, organizational hardship, this is in 100% of the cases, the eligible expenses will be between January and September of 2022. These are some of the examples of the eligible expenses. So again, this is going to be your operational type of costs. So payroll, benefits, mortgage rent, utilities, other operating costs. And again, I want to reiterate that the minimum grant funding per organization is $25,000 and the maximum is $250,000. So, we talked about earlier, you have to prove the amount of hardship your organization has experienced, and then you can apply to be reimbursed for these eligible expenses up to that amount. But if you're not also applying under eligible services, you have to have eligible expenses of $25,000. And as we just talked about, it also cannot have other funding dedicated to it already as well. So a lot of things to kind of check off there. Okay. And then ineligible expenses. And so before we move on, eligible expenses. So these are obviously under organizational hardship. At our webinar on January 10th for those applying under eligible services, we'll go and they'll be very different because they'll obviously be more programmatic because you're applying for what the service you're providing. So they'll be very different, but we'll go over that at the next webinar. Okay. Ineligible expenses, generally under all categories. So based on this being federal funding and our contract with Hamilton County, certain expenses cannot be covered. Those include funding debt service, legal settlements or judgments, deposits to rainy day funds or financial reserves, any political activity, including lobbying, gift cards, entertainment costs, and indirect cost rates. We can't have like a blanket negotiated indirect cost rate. We can pay for indirect costs, but they must be broken out one by one and have the accompanying documentation with those. And then under the organizational hardship category, expenses that are not related to the operation of the organization are ineligible. For example, if an organization is funded under the hardship category, buying a skid of books for children is ineligible because it's a programmatic, not an operational expense. However, that specific example would likely be an eligible expense for early education located in a QCT, qualified census tract, under category 2B. So again, just it's a fairly complex with all the different categories. So, probably reviewing this PowerPoint, and then of course, obviously our the pre-application tool will help you kind of determine how to apply. Okay. Do we need to pause, Amy, or should I go ahead into our scenarios?
I think I'm keeping Enough. So let's do scenarios because I think that this will make it a little bit more contextualized.
Real for people. Yeah, for sure. Okay. So the first scenario, we'll jump right in. My organization's main office is located in Butler County, but we have a satellite office in Hamilton County. We provide services in Hamilton County, and the operational expenses for the Hamilton County office and the Hamilton County services are what we're applying for. Are we eligible? That answer is yes, as long as the operational expenses are for the Hamilton County operations. And then obviously the Hamilton County services must be in one of the eligible services category. And those programmatic costs must be for the Hamilton County residents and meet the other criteria. But in general, yes, this would be eligible. So this is going back to that principal location eligible organization criteria. Okay, scenario 2. We started our nonprofit in May of 2020 to provide services to families who are experiencing difficulties due to COVID-19. Are we eligible to apply? No, unfortunately, organizations must have been in operation and providing social and family services since March of 2019. All right, scenario 3. We have experienced negative financial impact in 2020 due to the pandemic because we were unable to hold our annual fundraisers. In 2022, we anticipate to receive a grant that will cover our operational budget. Are we eligible to apply? No. Organizations must not only demonstrate a negative financial impact, but they must also be able to demonstrate and certify that the expenses they're requesting reimbursement for are not already going to be paid for with other federal, state, local, or other funding. Okay. Moving right along, scenario 4. We provide services to senior citizens, including case management, meals and health and wellness activities. We switched from providing in-person services to providing telehealth services, which is reimbursed at a significantly lower rate. Our billable revenue was lower in 2020 than in 2019 by $75,000. We were not able to find other sources to make up the gap. Are we eligible under organizational hardship? Yes. You are eligible. The organization experienced a negative financial impact due to COVID-19, and the loss of revenue in 2020 compared to 2019 was $75,000. Okay, using that same scenario, where the loss of revenue is $75,000, we want to apply to be reimbursed for the following: our $1,000 monthly mortgage and salary and benefits for caseworkers 1 and 2 that total $4,000 per month each. We will request these expenses for January 1, 2022 through September 30th, 2022. Are these eligible expenses? Yes. However, notice that the expenses only add up to $45,000. So even though you can document the loss of revenue of $75,000, you can only request reimbursement of expenses for the $45,000 because those are the document expenses that you have. Okay, scenario 5, my nonprofit operates a job training program. During COVID, we expanded our hours, which significantly increased our operating and staffing costs. We were lucky to receive increased fundraising, but are unsure about the sustainability of that additional revenue. Are we eligible to apply? No, but so you're not eligible under organizational hardship because they were assuming there's no documentation or numbers that you can't document the loss of revenue. However, you may be eligible to apply under eligible services category 2A, where job training is one of the eligible services. Okay, just a few more sort of logistical aspects of the program. So again, I just want to reiterate, the grant limitations are a minimum of $25,000 to a maximum of $250,000 per organization. So again, you can see that we have different areas of eligibility. So first, your organization has to be eligible under those very first things that we covered, like 501c3, Attorney General registration. Then you have to have an eligible use of funds. So those are, like organizational hardship, or you're providing one of the eligible services. And then you have to be able to provide the eligible expenses in the documentation. I know we just talked about how we're going to have plenty of money for each, but if somehow we don't, it'll be based on need, and then organizational access to funding, and then any efforts to reflect the geographic and demographic diversity of Hamilton County. We will definitely make that well known to all applicants if that happens. But like I said, we do not anticipate that being a situation that we run into. Okay, so here's sort of a general process. So the details and requirements are going to be in the RFP that's going to be on our website. I don't think it's up quite yet, but it should be in the next couple of days. The pre-application, as I've mentioned, here's the link that is on our website already. Let's go ahead and look at that. And then once you submit the pre-application, you'll receive an email directly with next steps to complete the full application. And we'll be using EC Impact. For those of you who are United Way partners, you should be familiar with that. Again, there are a few questions, but it's mostly uploading documentation. And then under organizational hardship, those full applications are due Tuesday, January 18th at 5 p.m. Late applications will not be accepted. And then for eligible services, those applications are due Sunday, January 30th at midnight. Again, late applications will not be eligible. So here's just an overview of the organizational hardship applications. As you can see, a lot of this is uploads, a few clarifying questions, and just trying to get an idea of your expenses. So again, you can see this is, there's a little bit of organizational information, what programs do you provide? Again, nothing too cumbersome there.